It was supposed to be a normal afternoon. Sunlight through the curtains, laughter from the baby's room. Then I heard the scream. "Don't touch my baby!" My daughter's voice cut through the house like glass. I froze mid-step, hand still reaching for the crib. Her face was pale, her eyes wild, as if I was a stranger in her home. I didn't say a word. I just looked at her, and at the child crying between us. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing that fear in her eyes. The next morning, the police came, and everything changed. Well, I'm glad you're here. If you're watching this, please like the video, subscribe. Tell me where you're watching from, and drop a heart if you liked the story. The house had been peaceful just moments before. The baby's soft cries blended with the ticking clock, and I was standing near the crib, smiling the way only grandmothers do. My hands hovered above the blanket, ready to soothe the child when it happened. Her voice tore through the quiet like thunder. "Don't touch my baby!" My whole body froze. The sound of her words hit harder than any slap ever could. I looked up and saw my daughter standing in the doorway, her face pale and trembling, eyes filled with something that didn't belong to love: fear. For a long second, the world stopped moving. My daughter's breath came in sharp bursts, her hand shaking as she clutched the baby to her chest. The little one began to wail, startled by her mother's sudden scream. I wanted to say something, to ask why she was looking at me like that, but no words came out. I just stood there, stunned, my heart pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. That wasn't the voice of the girl I raised. That was the sound of someone terrified, someone hiding something. Her husband appeared in the hallway, eyes darting between us. He tried to calm her, saying something under his breath, but she only tightened her grip on the child and turned away from me. I took a step forward, only for her to flinch back as if my touch was poison. My chest burned with confusion. What had I done to deserve that look? What fear had she built around me in her mind? The air in the house felt thick. I could smell the dinner I'd brought cooling on the table, untouched. Everything suddenly looked unfamiliar. The walls, the pictures, even my daughter. It was as if the home I once helped her build had shut its doors on me. I backed away slowly, not trusting my voice, not trusting my tears. The baby's cries grew softer behind me as I turned toward the door. Outside, the evening light had dimmed. I stood on the porch, gripping the rail, trying to steady myself. My daughter's words echoed again and again. "Don't touch my baby." It wasn't anger. It wasn't hate. It was fear. And I knew deep inside that fear always meant something was being hidden. Mothers know when a child lies, even when the child is grown. I had seen fear before, in my own reflection years ago, when I stayed silent to keep peace in a home ruled by control. That night, I sat in my living room, staring at the baby blanket I'd knitted weeks ago. I ran my fingers over the threads, wondering if I'd ever get to hold that child again. The words wouldn't stop repeating in my mind, looping like a warning. "Don't touch my baby." It wasn't the sentence itself that haunted me. It was the reason behind it. Something was wrong. Something deeper than hurt feelings or family tension. I knew that kind of trembling in a woman's voice, the kind that doesn't come from anger, but from being cornered. As the clock struck midnight, I made a promise to myself I wouldn't confront her in anger, and I wouldn't ignore it either. If there was something being hidden, I'd find it, quietly, carefully, and legally. I'd lost my husband to silence. but I wasn't going to lose my daughter to it too. By morning, my tears had dried. My hands no longer shook. Instead, I felt a stillness that only comes when you stop reacting and start deciding. I picked up my phone, not to call her, but to find out what she was so afraid of. That scream wasn't just about the baby. It was about something buried in paper, and I was going to dig it out. When I went back the next morning, the house felt different. The air was heavy, like it remembered what had happened. I rang the bell and waited, hoping she'd open the door with a softer face. But when she did, her eyes were red, and she avoided looking at me. She muttered a short hello, then turned away, holding the baby tight against her shoulder. It was like I had turned into a stranger overnight. I tried to keep my voice calm. I asked if she was all right, if something had happened. She didn't answer. Her husband came out of the kitchen, pretending everything was normal, talking about work, about the baby's sleep, about anything except what mattered. His hands trembled slightly as he poured coffee, though, and I noticed that. Fear hides in the smallest details, the way people avoid questions, the way they smile too quickly. I stepped closer, and she immediately shifted back, clutching the child tighter. My chest ached watching her like that. I had once held her the same way when she was small, terrified of storms hiding in my arms, and now she was hiding her own child from me. I didn't know whether to be angry or broken. I felt both at once. When I asked what was wrong, her answer was cold, practiced. Nothing. I just don't trust people easily. Not people. Me. She didn't trust me. The woman who raised her, who stayed up countless nights beside her sick bed, who gave her everything after her father's death. That moment hit like a knife. Her husband stood silently, eyes down, but I could see something flicker in him. Guilt. He didn't agree with her, but he didn't stop her either. He looked trapped, cornered by something that wasn't just family tension. I've seen fear before, not the kind you feel in danger, but the kind that comes from secrets that can destroy lives. The baby began to cry again, and she turned away to soothe her, humming shakily, avoiding me completely. I wanted to hold the child, but I didn't move. The sound of the baby's cries filled the space between us like a wall. Every second I stayed, the distance grew wider. I stood in that hallway for what felt like hours. The house was once my comfort. I had painted those walls myself when she moved in, helped arrange the nursery before the birth, folded tiny clothes that smelled of baby powder. Now it felt foreign, colder, as if the walls themselves were keeping her safe from me. Finally, her husband said quietly that they had plans and needed to rest. I nodded, though my heart felt like glass. I turned toward the door. Behind me, I heard her whisper something too low to catch, but her tone wasn't anger. It was fear, deep, choking fear. When I stepped outside, the wind hit my face, sharp and cold. I walked to the gate and looked back at the house. The curtains were already drawn. My own daughter had shut me out completely, and I didn't even know why. I wanted to cry, but tears wouldn't come. I felt hollow. On my way home, I kept hearing her voice. "Don't touch my baby." Over and over, like an echo that refused to fade. What was she protecting the baby from? Who had filled her head with such fear? And why did her husband look more nervous than angry? By the time I reached home, I wasn't just sad. I was unsettled. There was something underneath all of this, something buried that she couldn't say aloud. I didn't have proof yet, but I had instinct. And a mother's instinct, no matter how old she becomes, is rarely wrong. I sat down in the dark, listening to the clock tick. Somewhere, buried in papers. There was an answer. Something connected to that fear, that hesitation, that locked look in her eyes. And I was going to find it, even if it meant turning every memory upside down. That night, the house was silent, but my thoughts weren't. Every corner of my home seemed to echo my daughter's voice. I sat in the dim light of the living room, the clock ticking louder with each second. The chair where I rocked her as a baby creaked under my weight, like it remembered too. I closed my eyes, trying to calm my mind, but all I saw was her face. The fear in it, the tremble in her voice. That wasn't just anger. That was someone trapped. I made myself a cup of tea, though I didn't drink it. My hands were shaking. I'd never heard her speak to me like that, not once in all these years. The way she shouted, "Don't touch my baby," wasn't natural. It was defensive, desperate, like a woman being watched. I replayed that moment again and again, searching for clues in her tone, in her eyes. And then, as the night deepened, a name came to me. The nurse. I remembered the day the baby was born. The hospital room had smelled of antiseptic and flowers. My daughter had been tired but glowing, holding her newborn with such care. I remembered the nurse who kept checking the baby's tag, a woman with dark hair and too many questions about the father's side. At the time, I thought nothing of it, but now that memory wouldn't leave me alone. Something about that day had always felt slightly off. There were whispers in the hallway, confusion over the discharge papers, and a delay with the baby's birth certificate. I stood up and walked to the cabinet in the hallway. It still held my husband's old documents, bills, insurance papers, and a folder from when we handled legal paperwork for our daughter years ago. I opened it slowly, the paper smell rising like dust from the past. Inside were old hospital receipts, an address from the maternity wing, and a registration form with the hospital's official stamp. I ran my fingers over it, tracing my daughter's name and the date of birth. Everything seemed normal, until I looked at the handwriting in one section. It wasn't hers. Someone else had filled in part of the form. The signature line for the registrar looked rushed, almost forced, and beside it, a note, "Copy pending issue." My stomach turned. Why would there be another copy? I hadn't thought about this in years, but now the words "copy pending" felt like a door cracking open. I took out my phone and searched for the hospital's contact number. The line was automated, closed for the night. I left the phone on the table and sat there for hours, staring at the paper. My mind started connecting the pieces. Her sudden fear, the husband's strange silence, that nurse's unease, and now this document. There was something she wasn't telling me. Outside, the wind howled faintly, brushing the windows. I could hear the baby's laugh in my head, soft and sweet, reminding me what was at stake. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just about me and my daughter. That child was part of it now. I realized then that my daughter's fear might not be of me, but of someone watching her, controlling her, using the baby as leverage. I looked at the clock again. It was almost 3 a.m. I hadn't moved in hours. My tea was cold, untouched. I folded the old paper neatly and placed it back in the folder. I didn't want to believe what my instincts were whispering, but I couldn't ignore them either. A mother knows when danger is close, even if it wears a familiar face. By morning, I had made up my mind. I would call the registrar's office, not to accuse, not to argue, but to confirm. I needed facts. If there was something hidden, it would be buried in records, not emotions. And once I had those records, there would be no more fear, no more shouting, no more locked doors. The night that began with my daughter's scream ended with one quiet decision. I would find the truth, and no one would stop me. By dawn, I hadn't slept a single minute. My eyes were heavy, but my mind was sharp. The folder with the hospital papers lay open on the table like a wound that wouldn't close. I made myself strong tea and waited until the clock struck 9, the time government offices usually open. The moment the second hand hit the mark, I picked up the phone and dialed the registrar's number. My hands were trembling, but my voice came out steady. I gave them my granddaughter's name, date of birth, and hospital of delivery. The woman on the line hesitated after checking the records. I could hear the faint tapping of her keyboard, the shuffle of paper, and then a pause that stretched too long. Finally, she spoke, her voice lower this time. "Ma'am, could you confirm the mother's full name again?" I did. She went silent again, and that silence told me more than words ever could. When she returned to the line, she said something that made my stomach twist. "We seem to have more than one registration with that date of birth." More than one. I asked her to repeat it. She explained, carefully, that there were 2 entries. Same baby name, same date, same hospital, but different certificate numbers. One listed my daughter as the mother. The other had no mother's name at all. For a moment, I forgot to breathe. My mouth went dry. I asked if it was a mistake. She said she wasn't sure. That sometimes hospitals send amended certificates when families request corrections. Corrections. That word sounded like a lie wrapped in paperwork. I thanked her quietly and hung up. My hand stayed on the receiver long after the call ended. There were 2 birth certificates, one real, one shadowed. I couldn't understand how or why, but I knew I needed to see them both. So I grabbed my coat and left for the registrar's office myself. The ride there felt endless. My thoughts kept circling the same questions. Who requested a second certificate? Why was the mother's name erased? Why did my daughter look so afraid when I reached for the baby? When I arrived, the clerk looked up, startled to see me in person. I told her who I was, showed her the hospital form I'd kept from the day of the birth, and she nodded slowly. After a few checks, she disappeared into the back room. 10 minutes later, she returned with 2 thin files. My knees nearly gave way when I saw them. The first certificate looked exactly how I remembered. My daughter's name, the correct date, everything proper. But the second, it was almost identical except for one thing. The line that should have said mother was blank. The father's name was the same, but there was a faint smudge near his signature, as though someone had tried to erase and rewrite it. I asked the clerk if this was legal. She said quietly, "No, ma'am, it's not." She wouldn't say more. I left with photocopies of both certificates in my bag. Outside, the air felt colder, heavier. My heart was pounding, not from fear, but from clarity. Someone, perhaps my daughter's husband, perhaps his family, had tried to replace the truth with something forged. And my daughter's scream yesterday wasn't madness. It was warning. On the bus ride home, I held the papers tight against my chest. I stared out the window and realized something painful. My daughter had been living under fear, and I hadn't seen it. She wasn't protecting the baby from me. She was protecting her from them, from whoever had power over her life, her child, and her name. By the time I reached my street, my tears had dried. I walked straight to my desk, laid the papers side by side, and photographed them carefully. I didn't plan to argue with anyone. I planned to build a case. If they thought they could erase my daughter's name, they'd forgotten who raised her and who she came from. The truth might be buried under ink, but I was ready to dig it out, word by word, signature by signature. When I got home, I placed both certificates side by side on the kitchen table. The morning light fell across them, soft but revealing. I traced the letters with my finger. The paper felt ordinary, yet it carried the weight of two lives. One real, one stolen. The official stamps looked identical, but I'd lived long enough to know that identical things are where lies hide best. The first certificate, my daughter's, had familiar handwriting. I recognized her careful script, the same loops she used when writing grocery lists or birthday cards. The second certificate looked mechanical, typed with slight misalignment, as if someone had hurried the process. My eyes caught the biggest difference. On the line marked Mother, the space was empty. The ink hadn't faded. It had never been written. I felt my chest tighten. My hands shook, but I forced myself to stay calm. I took out my magnifying glass, the one I used for reading small print, and looked closer. The number sequence at the bottom of the forged document was off by 1 digit. Not a random error, a deliberate alteration. Whoever made this had access to official templates. My next step was to check the father's section. The name was there, but a smudge ran through it, a dark streak that had been rubbed with something oily, maybe correction fluid or even fingerprint grease. It wasn't clumsy work. It was calculated. Someone wanted to make sure this copy could pass as real in a hurry, but wouldn't hold up under light. I tilted the paper, and the mark caught the sun. Uneven texture. Forgery confirmed. I opened my notebook and began to write everything down. Every difference, every inconsistency, every small sign of deceit. The two certificates were dated only 2 weeks apart. That meant the fake was created long after the baby's birth, when my daughter was home, already fragile and isolated. The husband's family had connections. They always spoke of knowing people in the right places. Now I understood what they meant. I looked through my phone gallery for pictures from the hospital, the ones I took the day of the birth. I found one where my daughter held the baby, smiling weakly, and a nurse stood beside her. That same dark-haired woman again. She was looking straight into the camera, her expression unreadable. I zoomed in on her ID tag, and my heart skipped. The name matched the one on the original hospital registration slip I still had. She was the one who handled the discharge. That was no coincidence. That was the thread I'd been waiting for. I pulled out my old address book and flipped to the hospital's page. I found the extension number and called, asking if the nurse still worked there. The receptionist hesitated, then said, "No. She left suddenly a few months ago." My blood ran cold. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the two documents again. My daughter hadn't been lying. She hadn't been cruel when she shouted. She was protecting her baby from something much bigger, something she probably didn't even understand fully. But I understood enough. This wasn't just about custody or control. This was about ownership. A family with power trying to rewrite identity on paper, the easiest way to steal someone's child without ever opening a door. I'd seen it happen decades ago when a neighbor's granddaughter was taken after a forged adoption. Back then, I was too young to intervene. But not this time. I took photos of everything, the certificates, the notes, the hospital form, even the picture of the nurse, and uploaded them to a folder on my laptop labeled Truth. I wasn't going to confront anyone yet. I needed the law on my side, not emotions. When I finished, I sat in silence for a long time, my heart pounding. I felt grief for the years my daughter spent trapped in fear. But I also felt something else. Resolve. They wanted to erase my daughter's name from that paper. I was going to make sure her name would be the only one history remembered. By evening, I couldn't sit still anymore. The truth was sitting on my table, heavy and undeniable, and silence had stopped being an option. I picked up my coat, slipped the 2 birth certificates into an envelope, and walked straight to my daughter's house. The sun had already dipped behind the rooftops, the sky tinted in dull red, the kind of color that always comes before a storm. When she opened the door, her face went pale. She didn't need to ask why I was there. Her eyes darted to the envelope in my hand, then to the baby's room. She looked scared, like someone who had been waiting for this moment, but praying it wouldn't come. I stepped inside quietly. The air in the house felt thick. Every corner carried tension. The baby was asleep in her crib, her soft breathing the only calm sound in the room. I placed the envelope on the table between us. My daughter's lips parted, trembling. But she didn't speak. She didn't have to. I opened the envelope slowly and spread the papers in front of her. One true, one false. Her hands covered her mouth as she stared at them. Her shoulders began to shake. I'd never seen her like that, not even during her father's funeral. Fear had hollowed her out. After a long silence, she whispered that it wasn't her idea. Her husband's family had insisted on re-registering the baby to ensure security of inheritance. They told her it was a formality, a harmless legal step. She signed where they told her to sign, not knowing the full story. But when she tried to back out later, they threatened her. They said if she left, the baby wouldn't belong to her anymore. That on paper, she'd be no one. Her words broke me, but I didn't interrupt. I listened as she explained how they had hidden the second document, how her husband had started locking important papers in a cabinet she wasn't allowed to touch. She said the nurse, the same one from the hospital, was a cousin of her mother-in-law, the one who handled the registration. Everything fell into place like shattered glass forming a picture. She looked at me with tear-streaked cheeks, whispering, "Mum, I didn't mean to shout at you. I was scared." Her voice cracked on the word scared. I didn't cry. I had already run out of tears days ago. I took a deep breath and told her to sit down. I picked up the phone from her table and dialed the number for the police. I gave them the details calmly, every fact, every document number. My daughter stared at me in shock as I spoke, but I didn't stop. When I hung up, I told her the truth plainly. We weren't just a family anymore. We were a case file now. Within the hour, 2 officers arrived. I handed them the envelope and explained everything, the duplicate record, the forged entries, the threats. My daughter sat silently, holding her baby, shaking, but somehow relieved. The officers examined the papers, exchanged looks, and assured us that this would be investigated immediately. They told us the forgery was serious enough to fall under criminal fraud. As they left, one of them said, "You did the right thing, ma'am." I didn't feel heroic. I just felt old and tired, but lighter. My daughter broke down completely once the door closed. She clung to me the way she did as a child after a nightmare. I held her close, whispering nothing, just letting her cry. The baby stirred, then settled again. The house was quiet, but it wasn't the same silence as before. This one felt cleaner, like something poisonous had finally been aired out. That night, I stayed with them. I sat awake by the window, watching the flashing lights from the patrol car outside as officers interviewed neighbors. My daughter slept for the first time in days, clutching her child tightly. I knew the fight wasn't over, but it had begun. And this time, we weren't the ones hiding. I glanced at the baby and thought of how fragile truth can be. How easily people can rewrite it, stamp it, seal it, and call it law. But not tonight. Not anymore. By the next morning, I was done waiting for anyone else to save my daughter. The police had taken the copies, but I still held the originals, the ones that carried her real name. I sat at the kitchen table as the sunlight broke through the curtains and spread across the documents. That light felt like a sign, quiet, certain, impossible to ignore. My daughter was still asleep in the next room, her baby cradled in her arms. I watched them for a moment from the doorway, their faces peaceful after days of fear. That peace was worth more than anything I'd ever owned. It was the first time in months I'd seen my child rest without flinching at every sound, and I made a promise right there. No one would ever take that away again. I started by making a list. Every name, every phone number, every document that mattered. I called the registrar first and asked for a written confirmation about the duplicate birth certificate. They hesitated, but I pushed. Politely, firmly. Within an hour, they agreed to issue an official statement of irregularity. I didn't need power. I needed paper. Paper speaks in rooms where voices don't. Then, I called the same detective from last night. I asked him to make sure my daughter and grandchild were placed under temporary protective status until the case closed. He agreed without hesitation. The officers had seen enough to know this wasn't just a family dispute. It was a criminal manipulation of identity. After that, I rang my solicitor again. He answered immediately this time, perhaps expecting my call. I gave him instructions to draft an emergency injunction preventing anyone from filing new documentation under the baby's name. He understood before I finished the sentence. I could hear the faint tapping of his keyboard, the sound of law catching up with cruelty. Once the calls were done, I sat quietly, staring at the old phone in my hand. My fingers were trembling, but not from fear, from strength. From realizing that the years people called me weak had been years I was only patient. I wasn't slow to act. I was precise. By noon, 2 officers came to collect my daughter's statement officially. She sat in her robe, eyes swollen but calm, signing every line they gave her. When it was done, she looked up at me, uncertain. I smiled at her, small but steady. I told her she didn't need to explain or apologize anymore. The law now carried the burden she'd been carrying alone. Later that afternoon, I walked to the nursery where the baby lay sleeping under a pale blanket. I looked down at her and thought about everything I'd seen in life: war, loss, betrayal, survival. And yet this tiny life was what made me fight harder than ever. Because sometimes protecting your child doesn't mean shielding them from pain. It means facing the storm, yourself, so they can wake up in peace. By evening, the air in the house had changed. It wasn't heavy anymore. My daughter moved around slowly, cleaning, humming under her breath. The sound was faint but alive. I made dinner, soup and bread, and we ate together, wordless but not broken. Before bed, I received a call from the detective. He said they'd found the original digital record tied to the forgery. The husband's mother had accessed the registration system through a contact in the hospital. The same nurse. Both were now under investigation. He thanked me for providing the evidence that triggered the discovery. I thanked him, but what I really wanted to say was, "I told you so." Mothers always know. When I hung up, I looked out the window. The street was quiet. No flashing lights this time, no tension pressing on my chest. Just calm. I whispered to myself that I'd done what needed to be done. My daughter and granddaughter were safe. The truth was no longer hidden in some drawer or disguised behind a seal. It was written again, in full light, under the right name. And that night, for the first time in a long time, I slept deeply. The next morning began with the sound of engines and voices outside. When I pulled the curtain aside, I saw the police cars lined along the curb, blue lights cutting through the pale dawn. It didn't feel like fear anymore. It felt like consequence finally arriving at the right address. My daughter stood beside me, clutching her baby, her face pale but determined. She whispered, "They're here," and I nodded. The officers moved quickly, their tone calm but professional. They entered the neighbor's gate first, the home of her in-laws. I watched through the window as evidence bags appeared, documents sealed, boxes carried out. No shouting, no chaos, just quiet exposure, the kind that changes everything. Justice doesn't always make noise. Sometimes it's the sound of papers being zipped into plastic. Within an hour, one of the officers returned to our house. He asked me to identify the nurse in the photo I'd given them. I confirmed her name without hesitation. He nodded and said the forged record had already been verified. The file's digital footprint traced back to her hospital account. The forgery wasn't just a family's mistake. It was a crime built on trust and fear. I stood there in silence, the truth settling heavy but clean in my chest. For months, my daughter had lived under that shadow, made to believe she was paranoid, dramatic, or ungrateful. Now the law stood on our doorstep, confirming every instinct she'd buried. The officer said charges for document falsification and attempted custody fraud would be filed. He asked if we wished to press charges. I didn't even look at my daughter. I simply said, "Yes." By afternoon, the entire neighborhood knew. News travels fast in quiet streets. Some watched from behind curtains. Others came out pretending to check their mail. No one dared to speak to us directly. They all remembered how the husband's family had acted superior. The cars, the dinners, the airs of respectability. Now all that pride was being packed into evidence bags. The local newspaper sent a journalist to cover the case. She approached me gently, asking if I wanted to give a statement. I told her I didn't need sympathy, only the truth printed correctly. I gave her the official police confirmation and told her that this wasn't about revenge. It was about restoring a name. 2 names, actually, my daughter's and her child's. That evening, the story appeared online. Forgery uncovered in infant record. Grandmother's discovery leads to police probe. The comments section filled with strangers writing words like brave, motherly, and justice served. I didn't read them all. I didn't need praise. I just needed the truth to exist outside my living room. Later, my daughter received a call from her husband. He was under questioning, his voice broken, begging her to fix this. She didn't answer. She just held her baby closer. For the first time in years, she didn't sound scared, only steady. That silence from her was the loudest sound in the house. The following week, the police returned for follow-up statements. They confirmed that the nurse had confessed to altering the file under pressure from the husband's mother, who had promised her a sum of money. The motive was control, financial and emotional. They wanted legal leverage if my daughter ever tried to leave. That leverage was gone now, shredded in legal reports and courtroom paperwork. The forged certificate was destroyed officially under court order, and the true one reinstated in the National Registry. I held that corrected copy in my hands, the paper warm from the printer, but it felt like something sacred. Not just a document, but proof that truth had a heartbeat again. When the case finally closed, the detective who first visited us stopped by one last time. He shook my hand and said quietly, "You changed more than one life with this." I smiled faintly and told him I only did what any mother would do when her child forgets how strong she really is. That night, as I watched my daughter rock her baby to sleep, I thought of all the times women like me had been told to stay out of family business. This time, family business had been rewritten by justice. And it was signed, sealed, and filed under the right name. The days after the investigation felt slower, softer, like the house itself was trying to breathe again. There were no more police cars outside, no more phone calls that began with panic and ended in tears. The air smelled like peace, and for once, that peace didn't feel temporary. My daughter stayed with me for a while. She moved through the house quietly, often lost in thought. Sometimes I'd catch her standing by the window, just holding her baby and staring at the sky. I didn't ask what she was thinking. Some wounds don't heal faster with words. She needed silence, and I gave it to her. One morning, I woke up to the sound of her cooking breakfast. The smell of eggs and butter filled the house. It was the first time in months I'd smelled warmth instead of worry. She smiled faintly when I walked in. Her face still looked tired, but her eyes had changed. Steadier, less afraid. She placed a plate in front of me and said, "Eat, Mom." It wasn't just breakfast. It was her way of saying thank you. We spent most days like that, quietly rebuilding what had been broken. I took care of the baby when she needed rest, and she took care of the house when I felt tired. Slowly, the guilt that had weighed on her shoulders began to fade. Every time she laughed at something small, I felt like I was hearing her childhood again, returning piece by piece. One afternoon, a social worker visited us. She wanted to ensure my daughter was emotionally safe and financially independent after everything that happened. I listened as my daughter spoke for herself, calm, mature, confident. She didn't sound like the scared woman who once shouted at me to stay away from her baby. She sounded like the woman I raised her to be. When the social worker left, I told her she didn't need my protection anymore. She smiled and said, "Maybe not, but I'll never forget it." A few weeks later, she decided to move into a small apartment nearby. Not out of distance, but independence. We packed her things together. The baby giggled as we folded blankets and filled boxes. I didn't feel sadness this time. I felt relief. She wasn't running away. She was finally moving forward on her own terms. The first night after she moved, the house felt too quiet again. I sat in her empty room, the smell of baby powder still lingering in the air, and realized how long it had been since I'd felt peace instead of emptiness. I wasn't lonely. I was proud. Proud that the cycle had broken, that fear hadn't won this time. Weeks turned into months. The newspaper eventually moved on to other stories, the names of those who forged documents forgotten by everyone but us. But I didn't need headlines. I had proof of survival right across town. A daughter living freely with her real child, under her real name. Every Sunday, she visited. She'd bring the baby, now crawling and curious, and they'd sit in the same kitchen where everything once fell apart. The baby would reach for my face with tiny hands, and my daughter would smile and say, "She loves you." I'd smile back and think, "She should." I fought for her before she even knew who I was. Sometimes, I still think about that day. The shout, the accusation, the pain that nearly tore us apart. But now, it feels like something distant, almost like a different lifetime. I no longer see it as betrayal. I see it as fear. And fear can be forgiven when the truth finally arrives. At night, when I lock the doors and switch off the lights, I often glance at the drawer where the real birth certificate rests. It's more than paper now. It's a reminder that truth might take its time, but it always finds its way home. That night, I sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching the streetlights flicker against the quiet road. Everything was still. No cars, no shouting, no sirens, just calm. It struck me how quickly life can turn from chaos to peace when truth finally replaces fear. The same house that once echoed with tears now hummed softly with safety. I thought about the beginning, about that awful moment when my daughter shouted, "Don't touch my baby!" The words had cut deeper than any knife. They weren't just about anger, they were about terror. She wasn't protecting the child from me. She was protecting her from a world she didn't know how to fight. It took me time to understand that. But understanding doesn't mean forgetting. It means carrying the lesson without the bitterness. As I looked around my quiet living room, everything seemed smaller. The furniture, the problems, even the pain. The only thing that had grown was clarity. I realized that being a mother doesn't end when your child grows up. It changes shape. It becomes quieter, sharper, more strategic. It's no longer about feeding and teaching. It's about guarding, not just their life, but their truth. I remembered how helpless I felt that first day, standing in her doorway, watching her hold the baby like a shield. That helplessness didn't destroy me. It trained me. It taught me that love sometimes needs to act like law, not comfort. That's what saved her. That's what saved all of us. The next morning, I received a small envelope in the post. No return address, no card, just one sheet of paper inside. It was from my daughter. The note was short, written in her familiar, shaky handwriting. "Thank you for fighting for me when I forgot how to." I held it in my hands for a long time. No tears came, only warmth. That was enough. As days passed, I began volunteering at the local women's center. They asked me to share my story with mothers who felt powerless. Women whose children had been trapped by manipulation, lies, or fear. I told them not to shout, not to beg. I told them to think, to collect, to document, and to protect. Because that's what saved my daughter. Not anger, but proof. Not noise, but persistence. Sometimes people ask if I've forgiven everyone involved. The husband, his family, the nurse. The truth is, I don't waste my forgiveness on people who never earned it. I save it for myself, for the nights I stayed silent, thinking I had no right to interfere. That silence almost cost my granddaughter her identity. Never again. Now, when I walk through the park and see mothers pushing strollers or holding their children's hands, I smile. They have no idea how many invisible battles are fought just to keep a name safe, a family whole, a truth alive. It's a kind of war no one celebrates, but it matters more than anyone realizes. At the end of every long day, I still check the drawer where the real birth certificate lies. Not because I'm afraid it'll vanish again, but because it reminds me that sometimes the greatest victories don't happen in courtrooms or headlines. They happen in quiet kitchens, with a mother refusing to let lies rewrite her family. So, if you're listening to this, remember one thing. Love isn't always gentle. Sometimes it looks like paperwork, police reports, and sleepless nights. But in the end, love wins when truth stands taller than pride. Well, I'm glad you're here. If you're watching this, please like the video, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from. And if this story touched you, drop a heart below. Because sometimes the smallest heart can hold the biggest truth.